Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks again for listening and for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with biblical prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thanks again for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. Well, on today's program, Dr. Dave Schnitker will be interviewing Carol Rushton regarding her brand new article, The Arab-Israeli Conflict. The modern world has been embroiled in seeking peace in the Middle East between Jews and Arabs for almost 100 years now. Conferences, summits, meetings, agreements, and treaties have all fallen by the wayside. No amount of time, blood, sweat, tears, begging, pleading, bullying, and threatening have achieved the elusive goal of peace between Arabs and Israelis. Why is that so? Well, that's what today's program will deal with. So let's join Dr. Schnitker and Carol Rushton for today's fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Dane. It is a real privilege to have Carol Rushton on the program again today to continue discussing her brand new article entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict. This is actually part one of a three-part extended article which will comprise our Last Days Beacon for the months of March, April, and May of 2018. This will be an excellent series that will give you a deep understanding as to why the Arab-Israeli conflict is ongoing and seems to be untouched by the several peace treaties that we have attempted, Americans have tried to accomplish in the Middle East, really going back the last 70 years. And so this is an extremely important series of studies that Carol is undertaking that we are going to be sharing over the next 3 months. Now, if you're not a subscriber to the Last Days Beacon, or if you would like extra copies of this particular article, our announcer will share how to do that at the end of today's program. Well, I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Carol for many years at a previous ministry, and I've also had the honor of working with Carol's father, the late Noah Hutchings, having worked and associated with Brother Hutchings for about 40 years. Noah graduated to glory a couple years ago after an amazingly productive ministry in which he wrote over 100 books and perhaps did as many as 10,000 radio broadcasts. Carol was very much a part of Noah's ministry. She has shared how she began editing his radio scripts when she was in the 8th grade and continued serving the Lord by assisting Noah in his writing ministry. Through the years, Carol is also an accomplished author and broadcaster as well, and was of great help in launching our ministry just about 2.5 years ago. And I've recently recommissioned Carol to do what she loves to do and does best, perhaps, although she's a great cook, too. I have to say, I'm not sure which one she does best, but she's an excellent writer. And so she has resumed writing and broadcasting for us once again. So, Carol, welcome back to our program today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, your first article, The Arab-Israeli Conflict, is subtitled, Why There Will Not Be Peace in the Middle East Until Jesus Christ Returns. And what you attempt to do in this ambitious article is really chronicle about 2,500 years of Middle Eastern history in terms of tracing the roots of this conflict, which obviously is still continuing today. This conflict stretches back almost 4,000 years, as we saw last week, to the time of Isaac and Ishmael. It worsened with the incestuous children born to Abraham's naughty nephew Lot. Then it became even more intense with the descendants of Jacob and Esau, the terrible twins that were battling really from the womb. The descendants of Esau, the Edomites, have been intractable enemies of Israel for many, many years. So today we're going to move forward in the timeline as we continue to explore the biblical roots of the conflict. Now, one of Esau's descendants, I believe one of his grandsons, was a man named Amalek, the father of the Amalekites. Well, Carol, how do the Amalekites figure into this animosity that exists between Arabs and Israelis today?
Well, I think it's very interesting that of all the children and grandchildren that Esau had, and that this animosity that Esau had for Jacob was passed down through all of his descendants, but in particular Amalek, because that's one of the few grandsons that actually became their own, that was large enough, became their own separate tribe or nation. And for some reason, the Amalekites were particularly hostile to Israel and the Jews. Whenever Israel got anywhere close to them, the Amalekites would come out and fight them. And there was an account of after the Israelites had left Egypt, and they came out. They hadn't even reached the promised land yet. And so, but the Amalekites came out against Israel, and they wanted to fight them, and for some reason, the scriptures don't say why. But at that time, they really didn't have any choice but to fight them, and so there's a famous account of how when Moses would lift his hands up in the air, Israel would prevail. Well, Moses couldn't keep his hands lifted up in the air all the time. So when he would get tired and lower his hands, then the Amalekites prevailed. So finally, Moses' brother Aaron and another Israelite, Hur, they in order to get this over with, this battle over with, they had Moses sit down on a stone, and then they lifted Moses' hands up in the air to keep his hands up in the air so Israel would win the battle, which Israel finally did under Joshua. That was one of the first battles that they ever fought. And for some reason, the Amalekites were always spoiling for a fight with the Jews.
And there's no record in the Old Testament of the Jews provoking the Amalekites.
No.
They just couldn't stand to have the Israelites anywhere near their territory.
Yes, and it's very amazing because the scripture doesn't really actually say why. There just must have been a very deep-seated hatred. And the scriptures kind of indicate that the Amalekites may have been trying to pick off some of the stragglers. You know, if you were weak or infirm and you couldn't keep up with the rest of the bunch. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of people here. You know, at least 600,000 men, if not more. And that doesn't count the women and children.
Yeah, some estimate there could have been as many as 2.5 million Israelis during the wilderness wanderings.
Right. And so there's some scriptures sometimes do indicate that the Amalekites were picking off the stragglers, you know, so perhaps Israel just didn't have a choice but to have to, look, we can't allow them to do this. We've got to stop this. So they had no choice. And then when they after their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they were coming back close to the promised land. They were going to go into the promised land, and God had told them to wipe out the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, all these different people groups, because they were very morally corrupt. The Amalekites was one group that the Lord said, you need to wipe these people out. Well, they evidently didn't do that because they were still around when hundreds of years later, when Saul became king and was anointed by Samuel. So they were still around because God told Samuel to tell Saul, okay, this is about time we took care of the Amalekites. They've been around too long. You need to take care of them.
So they were still warring against Israel, these Amalekites. They just didn't know how to stop.
No. And so they evidently under Joshua and then under whoever was whoever followed Joshua as far as the judges were concerned, they never really took care of the Amalekites. They never followed God's command because they were still around.
And as I recall, Saul didn't do a thorough job of it either.
No, he sure didn't.
He had that partial obedience going on, even with the Amalekites. And of course, Samuel had said, hey, you got to get rid of these Amalekites. And he didn't.
No.
And there's probably some descendants of Amalek even yet today in these Middle Eastern countries.
There could be. I mean, there probably, if there are, they've been absorbed by the other Arab people groups in the Middle East.
Now, you also mentioned 3 other tribes that we actually just began to touch on last week, but you mentioned specifically 3 tribes that were historic foes of the Israelis. These were the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites. Now, we talked about the origins of these 3 tribes, Edomites, of course, being descendants of Esau, Ammonites, of course, being descendants of Ammon, and Moabites, of course, being descendants of Moab, the 2 incestuous children of Lot. Tell me about these tribes and their conflicts with the Israelis through the years.
Well, when Moses was leading the Israelites and they were about to get close to the Promised Land, of course, we discussed a little bit about this at the close of the program, the previous program. Moses asked for permission to go through their land. And the hatred and the hostility was so bad that all these groups refused to allow them to pass through their land. And they would come out and with their soldiers threatening to fight Israel. Now, God was very specific. He says, I don't want you to fight them. I want you to leave them alone. This is I've gone ahead and set up their kingdoms for right now, and for right now, this land belongs to them. I don't want you to actually fight them right now. But just asking for permission to walk through them, it says, we're not going to take anything, we won't bother you, we're just trying to get to another place. And to have that kind of hostility, said, well, no, you can't at all. And even the king of the Moabites was so concerned about the Israelites because they'd already had several battles, and this had gotten back to the other countries around. And so the king of Moab actually hired a seer or a prophet whose name was Balaam.
Oh, yes.
And some of us might remember the story of Balaam and how he, the king of Moab wanted Balaam to curse Israel. But every time Balaam tried to curse Israel, he would bless Israel instead.
Inadvertently. Or
Inadvertently.
Against his will.
Yes. And he would tell the king of Moab, hey, well, look, I have to say what God tells me to say. I can't go against this, even though you want me to curse Israel. And so I don't think that they really fought the Moabites at that time. They were just wanting to go through their land so they could get to the Canaanites and destroy them as God had told them to do.
So the animosity of the king of Moab was such to where he was even trying to corrupt one of the prophets of God.
Yes. Well, you see, they even and you had some interactions with the Moabite women in that. And the scriptures don't really say very clearly, but on their way before they actually got into the land of Canaan, the Moabites sent women over there to the Israelites and actually corrupted them and got them to worshiping other false gods and having sexual relationships outside of marriage with the Moabite women. And there's a famous passage in Scripture where one of the priests actually took a javelin and speared through an Israelite man and a woman, a Moabite woman, and killed them.
Wow.
And so the Moabites, if they couldn't defeat Israel on the battlefield, they certainly were going to try to corrupt them, more them.
Yeah. So again, this deep-seated hatred and animosity toward God's people that was irreconcilable. There was no way that through diplomatic means they would be reconciled. They ended up having to battle them all along the way.
And it's very strange because there just doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to their hatred, or why they were hated the Jews so much. And I find this even today. There's really not any rhyme or reason why the Arab people hate Israel. It's just because they're Jews. There doesn't seem to be a specific reason.
Could there be a spiritual component?
Probably so.
Yeah, spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
Obviously, the devil and his seed hates God and his seed. It's that conflict of the ages that we see even beginning to play out in the Old Testament. And I think we see it playing out even today. So I think there's a spiritual component of that. And maybe we can talk about that as we look at your subsequent articles. But there is something about it that seems to be irrational unless you understand there is a spiritual component
Yes,
to this.
it does. It's to the Western mind, it's not something that a Westerner can really fully understand and I think appreciate unless you know some of the underlying history of the two peoples. And then you get a kind of a glimpse into it, but a lot of it does seem very, very irrational.
Well, you also deal in your article with a relatively long period in Jewish history that commences with Cyrus the Great, the Medo-Persian king, in the 6th century BC and extends forward to Muhammad in the 7th century AD. Give us, in brief, some history of the Arab-Israeli conflict during this period.
Well, the Assyrians, after the kingdoms had split, then there were the northern tribes, the 2 northern tribes, and then you had the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The Assyrians eventually conquered the northern kingdom of Jews, and then eventually the Babylon. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had 2 or 3 runs at Israel, starting in, I think it was about 606 BC, and then they finally finished them off, I think, about 586 BC, and that's when they actually destroyed the temple and brought a lot of the people back.
Knocked the wall down. They pretty well shredded the city.
Yeah, and so Nebuchadnezzar took a bunch of, had already taken quite a few Jews back with him in the first overrun of the country. And that's probably the group that Daniel, the prophet, was in. And then when he came back subsequently to finish everything off in about 586 BC, he took a lot of them as slaves back to Babylon, destroyed the temple, took the temple artifacts, and they lived in Babylon for about 70 years or so. Now, the Babylonian Empire just started to deteriorate. And I think it was a grandson, Belteshazzar, who, that was the one who had the famous writing on the wall. And they had to get Daniel in, out of mothballs because he'd been forgotten about and pushed aside. And to say, well, to interpret this. And then the Medo-Persian military had come in that night and basically very silently took over the entire city and killed Belteshazzar and took over everything. Now, actually, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, predicted that Cyrus, even about between 100 to 260, 70 years
Something
before.
around 150 years before Cyrus's birth.
Yes, actually predicted that there would be a king named Cyrus that would allow the Jews to return to their homeland. And of course, this was before Babylon had even really arisen as a world power. And so when the Medo-Persians conquered Babylon, Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their ancient lands. He also allowed a lot of other ancient peoples to return to their homelands as well. The Jews weren't the only ones, but he did allow the Jews to return and allow them to rebuild the temple. And it was during that time period that you had other prophets also, probably right before and right after that, that prophesied that the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites would be wiped out as a people. They would eventually cease to exist. And one thing about the Edomites that I always thought was very interesting is that part of the Edomite territory was Petra in Jordan. And that's where
Wasn't it like their principal city, or what we might say would be their capital city?
Yes.
Of the Edomite kingdom?
Yeah, it was considered Mount Seir. And the Bible says Mount Seir is Edom, and the Edomites are from descendants of Esau. So I've always thought that was very, very interesting, because it's the rose red or the rock red cities, and that's how it's known. But it's now actually that Petra is part of the kingdom of Jordan right now. I thought that was very interesting. But the Edomites, what compounded the sin of the Edomites is that when Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar were conquering Israel and the Jews, the Edomites cheered them on and helped them and gave them moral and physical support. And then they also, the scriptures say that when, I think it was in Obadiah, when some of the Jews were fleeing Jerusalem and trying to flee Nebuchadnezzar's army to get away from them, the Edomites picked them off and killed them and would not, so the scriptures are very clear about this. So God's judgment was very harsh toward Esau's descendants and Edom, the kingdom of Edom.
And as I recall, the Edomite city of Petra, after the 1st or 2nd century, went into steep decline and was, as I recall, basically deserted for centuries.
Yes.
Because the Edomite kingdom had basically disappeared. Yeah. The judgment of God fell upon the Edomites.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons why, because they didn't show any sympathy or compassion for their brothers. And they killed the ones that were fleeing from Babylon, the Babylonian army, Nebuchadnezzar. They killed those, and they didn't take them in, they didn't help them, and they cheered, they were cheering, Nebuchadnezzar on. Yeah, kill those people.
So let me ask this. Even after the dispersion of Israel, of course we know that much of that dispersion took place in Judah, that is, 68 to 70 with the siege in Jerusalem, the fall of the great city in AD 70. Of course, many Jews were slaughtered, and then most of the rest were dispersed. Did there continue to be an animosity even during those first 6 centuries of the modern period or the Christian era between some of these ancient tribes, even as Israelites were in dispersion? Probably
so. But you don't, history doesn't really record a lot of it. I mean, at that point, even before then, some several hundred years before them, you had the ascendancy of the Greek Empire under Alexander, and Alexander the Great conquered the known world at that time, most if not all of it. And so, the Jews were a conquered people, subjected people under the Grecian Empire, under Alexander the Great, and so were all the other Arab peoples groups or the other whatever nations or groups of tribes or people in that area, they also fell and were subjected under Greece and Alexander
So that
the Great.
might have had the effect of suppressing the hostility and rivalry between.
Yeah, I mean, because everybody
was oppressed.
everybody
They
was
were all
oppressed.
under the thumb of Greece,
Yeah,
and of course later the more oppressive thumb of Rome.
Yes, because Rome replaced Greece.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these mighty empires, very militaristic, very strong, and they were able to impose their will over a great number of people at one time. So everybody was fighting them or being subjected under them.
Right.
So the first it was the Greeks and then the
But
Romans.
it doesn't mean that these warring tribes reconciled.
No.
They were all suffering alike under the tyranny of these empires.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there's not a whole lot of recorded history from about the Greeks on, as far as a lot of conflict between the Jews and Arab peoples or Arab people groups, like the Ishmaelites, Edomites, Moabites, Midianites, whatever those groups were. There's not a lot of recorded, as far as the fighting and everything, and so history's pretty quiet as far as conflicts between all of these groups. And then of course we had the rise of Christianity too,
Right.
that comes into the mix too. And the Jews and the Christians didn't always get along because Christianity came out of Judaism.
Right.
And so,
of course, the New Testament records some of the conflict in the early church with the Jewish hierarchy.
right.
And I'm sure that continued to some extent even after the dispersion. Perhaps not as intense because,
Right.
of course, the Jewish hierarchy was scattered during the dispersion as well.
So, but Jews were dispersed throughout all the world after 70 AD, and then again in between 125 and 135 when you had the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba, and then the Rome had to come back in and finally, get rid of the rebels or the zealots once and for all, and disperse Jews throughout the known world at that time. And there's just not a lot of conflict because I guess the Jews, number one, Rome was ruling, and number two, there really wasn't a nation anymore really at that point. There hadn't really been for a long time anyway. And so there's not a lot of historical documentation that there was a lot of fighting or conflict. There probably were tensions between, because you
Probably on the interpersonal level, individual Jews probably experienced the same animosity and segregation, I guess you might say, from opportunities by these Arab people. But there was no center of power or organized or center of religion after the dispersion.
And there could have been times probably when the Jews, Christians, and Arabs lived in the same city, and they could have been getting along just fine. But of course, that all changed when Muhammad came along.
6th century.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about that in your next article.
Okay.
But yeah, something dramatically changed and intensified in the 6th century. And in a word, Muhammad.
Yes.
Muhammad changed everything.
Yeah, he changed everything, didn't he?
Right. And it's still rippling out today.
Oh, yes. Hasn't changed.
Well, folks, we'll have to wait for part 2 of the article to deal with the era of the Mohammedans, as they used to be called, and the intensified persecution of Jews and Christians that has been experienced ever since. Well, I think we've done a good job introducing the content of this article. So, Carol, thanks for rejoining me for today's program. Well, friends, we have been talking with Carol Rushton about her brand new and very timely article entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict. This is actually the first of a 3-part article or series of articles that is being published as our March, April, and May editions of the Last Days Beacon. These articles will give you a deep understanding as to the seemingly irresolvable hatred many Arab peoples have toward the nation Israel. By the way, these articles will be incorporated into a brand new book that Carol is writing entitled Understanding the Middle East. Stay tuned for future information regarding this exciting new book. Now, I'm sure, friends, that you will want to obtain multiple copies of the March Last Days Beacon article entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict, Why There Will Not Be Peace in the Middle East Until Jesus Christ Returns. And now our announcer, Dane Rome, will share how you can obtain this timely article.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitker. Dear friends, every month Southwest Prophecy Ministries produces an excellent article entitled The Last Days Beacon. These articles deal with a wide variety of subjects pertaining either to Bible prophecy or Christian liberty. This month's article is entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict, Why There Will Not Be Peace in the Middle East Until Jesus Christ Returns. We're offering a complimentary copy of this article to each one who requests it. Simply go to our website, www.swpm.us, and then click on the Bookstore tab. Type Last Days Beacon in the Search tab and order your free copy of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. You may also order extra copies to share with family and friends. You may order 5 copies for $5, 25 copies for $15, or 100 copies for $60. And when you order extra copies, you will automatically be placed on our mailing list to receive the monthly mailing of the Last Days Beacon. Well, friends, please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Until then, this is Dane Rome saying thanks again for listening.